Welcome, and thank you very much for tuning in. I wanted to put together just a short series of videos on the subject of Psalm 91. It's a psalm that I've been enjoying over the past few days, and a psalm which speaks so beautifully of the person of the Lord Jesus. It's the kind of thing that Christians need encouragement with in the day and age in which we're living. So I'm going to do a series of 4 videos. They will be short videos, and they will just take us through some of the key points of the psalm, and I trust encourage our appreciation of God's beloved Son. So we're just going to read the first 2 verses of Psalm 91, a very well-known psalm, and this is how the first couple of verses read. It says, "He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High," and here is the promise, "shall abide under the shadow," that is the protective shadow of the Almighty. And really the rest of the psalm unfolds what it means to be under the protective shadow of the Almighty. But that verse 1, is the voice really of the Spirit of God. Let me read it again. "He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty." But then when you move into the second verse, this really is changing the speaker. And now we have the person of God's Son, not the Spirit, but the Son who is speaking. And he really is the only one who can ultimately claim that when he was here, a man amongst men, he perfectly dwelt always and constantly in the secret place of the Most High. And this is his personal testimony from verse 2. He says, "I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress, my God. In him will I trust." So the voice of the Spirit in verse 1 and the voice of the Son of God in verse number 2. Now we'll say a little bit more about those 2 verses in the next video, God willing. But what I want to say over the next few minutes is just give you a very simple and brief introduction to Psalm 91. This psalm is what we call a wilderness psalm. And we call it a wilderness psalm because it belongs to the 4th book of Psalms. And you know that the Psalter as a whole, 150 psalms, divides into 5 separate books. Well, the 4th book of Psalms runs from Psalm 90 to Psalm 106. And each of these books of Psalms, they correspond with a book of the Pentateuch. So this is Psalm 91, found in the 4th book of Psalms, and that 4th book corresponds to the book of Numbers in the Pentateuch. The book of Numbers, of course, it reminds us of the journeyings of God's people in the wilderness. And this psalm is about a perfect man who is passing through a wilderness scene. Verse 10 says this, "Neither shall any plague come nigh to thy dwelling." And the word dwelling there is really the word for tent. So we have the thought of a pilgrim people that are dwelling in tents and they're passing through the wilderness. Now this psalm possibly, we don't know much really about the history of the psalm, who wrote the psalm and so on, but possibly this was a psalm that was actually composed in the wilderness. So it would take us back before the time of David, who wrote many psalms, but this psalm is anonymous. And there is a Jewish tradition which says that when a psalm is anonymous, then you assign the authorship of that psalm to the last named writer. And so if you turn back to the preceding psalm, Psalm 90, you'll find that that's the only psalm we have in our Bible which is entitled as a Psalm of Moses. So it is possible that these 2 psalms having been put together, Psalm 90, certainly a Psalm of Moses, perhaps Psalm 91 was also a Psalm of Moses. And perhaps he composed it when he was wandering with God's people through the wilderness, having been brought out of the captivity of Egypt. And of course, there are signs again in this psalm that could be the case. For example, verse 3 says this, "Surely he will deliver thee from the noisome pestilence, from the destructive plague." And I suppose that God's people already knew God's deliverance from the plagues of Egypt. Verse 4 says this, "He shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings shalt thou trust." Well, God's people knew that on Passover evening, The Lord said, when I shall see the blood, I will pass over you. That is, the Lord passed his protective wings over his people as they sheltered beneath the blood. So maybe composed by Moses as God's people were moving through the wilderness. You say, well, why did Moses rather write a psalm like this? Simply to inspire the confidence of God's people in God himself, and to draw comfort from God's promises for the circumstances in which they found themselves. And of course, that's what many Christians are doing today. In unprecedented times, in unprecedented circumstances, God's people are looking at this psalm and they're seeking just to inspire confidence in their God and to draw comfort from his promises. Now, there's something I just need to point out. Whilst we claim many of these promises for ourselves as Christians, as believers, you will notice that these promises, that is, abiding under the shadow of the Almighty, these promises are conditional. And the condition is found in verse 1. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High. So here are the blessings, the protective blessings that flow from a life of unbroken communion with God. Now, I'm not sure that there's any believer who would say that their life has always been a scene of unbroken communion with their Father. There is only one really who can claim that, and that would be the person of the Lord Jesus. So all of these promises are good for him, and certainly this is a psalm that sings concerning him. So if we take it as a whole and we seek to apply it to believers today, the psalm certainly is a statement of absolute trust in God. Here is a God who can deliver his people. Here is a God who very often will deliver his people, but he may not necessarily always deliver his people. It's not that necessarily he must deliver his people. Sometimes God chooses to bring his people into difficult circumstances that ultimately it might be for their good, and ultimately it might be for his glory. So that's just a word of introduction to this psalm. And you might say that the promises of the psalm, it's not really promising security from trials. It's really promising security and peace in and through the trials. And that was something that the Lord Jesus knew in his experience below. So ultimately, and I just want to say one more thing in relating this psalm to the psalm that goes before Psalm 90. Ultimately, this is a psalm that finds its perfect fulfillment in the person of the Lord Jesus. He is the perfect man. Now, when you think about Psalm 90, Psalm 90 speaks of the failure and the frailty of the first man, the man in the flesh. Let me give you some examples. Psalm 90 in verse 7 reads like this: We are consumed by thine anger. By thy wrath are we troubled. Verse 8 says, You have set our iniquities before thee, our secret sins in the light of thy countenance. So there is something of the failure of the human race. That Psalm 90 also speaks of the frailty of the human race. Verses 5 and 6 speak about human beings growing up like grass. And in the morning it flourishes, but in the evening it's cut down and it withers. In a very famous statement in Psalm 90, the psalm also speaks about the days of our years being 60 years and 10, 70, or being by reason of strength 80 years, 80. So it is the failure and the frailty of the first man, the man in the flesh, the human race. But what a contrast when you come to Psalm 91. This is not the failure and the frailty of the first man, but Psalm 91 is speaking about the faithfulness of the second man, the perfect man, the one who is the Lord out from heaven. And listen to what he says. Here's his faithfulness. Verse 2, I will say of the Lord, he's my refuge. He's my fortress. He's my God. and in him will I trust. And far from this being a person who was open to the judgment, the wrath, and the anger of God, here is a person who, at the end of the psalm, Psalm 91, here is a person who is delighted in by God. In fact, the Father says this, because he hath set his love upon me, I will deliver him. Said the Father from heaven, this is my beloved Son, in whom is all my delight. Now that's just a little introduction to Psalm 91, and we trust that in the next video we'll say a few things about the first two verses, the secret place of the Most High.